You ready? Yeah? Ublumi, good afternoon. Welcome to the Tunnganarniq show. My name is Margaret Naxana. We are broadcasting live here in Inuvik at the Inuvialuit Communications Society. I'm here today with Anne Thrasher from Polytech. Today we are going to be talking about storytelling. So, how are you?
I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm Anne Thrasher. I come from the marine community of Polytech, which is in the Darnley Bay area, protected by a larger harbor, which is the Franklin Bay, just below the Amundsen Gulf. So we're quite inside the archipelago above us, the islands above us, and the people from Polytech are all of the Inuvialuit regional settlement area, one of the 6 communities. So the population of Polytech is 260 to 80. The only transportation in and out of the community is by air, occasionally by skidoo, and the people thrived within the area of between Polytech, Cape Perry, and Leddy Harbor in the early years. So some of the stories that I will tell are partly from Cape Perry, Leddy Harbor, Polytech, and I'm going to start with Lizard Creek.
So which place do you want to start with first?
Okay, I'm going to start with Lizard Creek. In this millennium, we traveled with a couple from from Polytech. His name was George Tunnganarniq and his wife Mariah. They have an outpost in Lizard Creek, halfway up the Franklin Bay. So our travels from Polytech to Lizard Creek would be an hour and a half to 2 hours. And every year we would travel with George and Mariah. So one November we hitched up. We were going to camp a few days, and we traveled all the way and made it an hour and a half to Lizard Creek. Reaching Lizard Creek, where his cabin is, we had to enter a tiny little harbor, a small little harbor, and we all went on to the little harbor. I wasn't the first one, but the men went in first, and their skidoos sunk.
Oh.
And that's in November. I was alone on my skidoo, which is a tiny 340. So I traveled a bit and I made a little circle and made it closer to the shore. But the men, when I had a look at them, mostly the seats had disappeared, and I knew that they were wet. November, between minus 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. His wife, Mariah, had made it to the shore and immediately rushed to the cabin to begin lighting the stove to warm up, because I knew that the men were soaking wet. Their skidoos had dead stop. So they started to walk to mine. I was standing up on the seat not wanting to get wet, but the men were going to tie rope on my skis and pull it up just so that I don't sink. But in doing so, I also fell in.
Oh my goodness.
And my skidoo boots were soaked and wet. And they did make it and brought my skidoo out. The skidoo was not in water, which was good. The men started it. They sent me immediately to the cabin to dry out, and already cakes of ice had covered my skidoo boots when I reached. So we started heating up the cabin, but the men took ages and ages. They used my skidoo to eventually pull their skidoos out successfully, and by the time they had gotten into the cabin, we had 2 primer stoves on and the fuel stove on, which was taking its time to warm up. And the men immediately took their socks, boots, everything off, and changed. And right from there, I knew that there was nothing that we were going to be doing that evening, because we usually go around the camp, get ready for the next day. I just immediately started cooking, knowing that a meal will warm them up much faster. So there were a lot of boots, duffels, socks, and everything hanging up to dry. It eventually dried up. And Lizard Creek has its share of stories and lores, and it's a wonderful place to be. And George Mariah goes to Lizard Creek right from the beginning of July to the end of October. And their children don't come back to town between or after then.
Yeah.
They live traditionally. Every child to the youngest grandchild has his purpose around the camp. They live very well. So that night, the men were very tired. We knew that there wasn't going to be very much talk. They'd be going out after everything dried up. They'd be going outside to work on their skidoos. And lucky if nothing worked, my little tiny skidoo would work to go back to town. But it was all quiet. And after the place totally warmed up, they shut the gas lamps off. And it's a very huge house. So George and Mariah are sleeping in sleeping bags on one end, and we're way back on the other side. Between us is a huge table for gathering meals. And the lights went out early that evening. I think the exhaustion and the trauma of extreme cold, almost hypothermia at one point. So it was very quiet, and I couldn't sleep. And everybody was sleeping. So I heard a sound, because where they have their table, they have windows on all 4 corners of their cabin, because it is grizzly bear country.
Yeah.
And there's no grizzlies in November. But I heard a sound, and I felt that we were not alone. And I called George, Mariah, Andy. No one answered. George, no answer, and I thought, I'll just have to tell them in the morning. but this constant stare, like something is looking right into your soul, just kept on going for the whole night. But I eventually fell asleep. And the men were up early in the morning, and Mariah also, and I jumped up and checked all my skidoo boots, winded gear, and everything. They all dried up during the night, which was really good. And I said, I know that you were all tired last night, but something else was with us last night.
Mm-hmm.
I said, in that window, because it was low enough, anything could look through. So George puts on his boots and goes behind the house. And he rushed in, dressed up really quick. We're asking him what is going on, and he's getting his rifle. And he started trying to start a skidoo, and it couldn't. So he had to come in and ask me to use my skidoo.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked him first, what was it? Wolverine staring right in the window. And it answered to the eeriness that I felt that night with no lights on. So I allowed, take my skidoo, go ahead, track it down. So we had breakfast.
Yeah.
And we continued. So continued getting the camp ready. The men eventually got their skidoos going, thank goodness. And we were going to go around and fish in some of the long lakes. And because of the stories we heard that some of the fish were as the size of humans in size. So we got ready to go out, made a short day out. The daylights were getting very short in November, so our time outside wasn't very, very long. And so I started cooking supper when we got home. And again, George sighted the wolverine and went out chasing it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was Mariah, myself, and Andy. And Mariah stood outside watching his skidoo lights because it's a upward hill for long ways. She wanted to watch him get, eventually return. And then she came in and she said, Anne, I hear drumming outside.
Mm-hmm.
I said, okay. So, and I couldn't leave my cooking. I'm sitting on the floor with the primer stove, and Andy went out with her, and they both came back in. They could hear the drumming very clearly, and it came that ice right outside of their house had gathered so much from the high winds that it became a ridge.
Yeah.
So they both went outside. I turned the primer stove. I thought, boy, we might have some visitors.
Yeah.
So I went out for a bit and I listened, and they said, they told me it's really loud. Yeah, I'm trying to hear it, but I couldn't. So we all went back into the cabin, and George eventually arrived. And when he arrived, Andy and Mariah told him what their experience out there. And we had supper, we gathered, and we were going to have another day eventually. and another day, next day to go fishing, because Mariah had lost a huge trout.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of our huge hooks with the largest tongs. And in trying to pull up, two of the tongs went flat, but she lost the trout.
Mm-hmm.
So we were going to go back and try another day of adventure. So we had our supper and we went to sleep. We were going to have an early morning because our days were getting shorter and our time out would end in darkness again. So that early morning, the men got up at about 6 o'clock, and I could hear both Mariah and Andy telling George about the drumming out on the ice, and he listened to them, and he said, "What about Annie?" I said, "She tried to hear, but she couldn't." And he looked at them and said, "Whatever it was you heard, it wasn't after her."
Mm-hmm.
So they waited till daylight, and he and Andy went to the point where they had heard the music, because they both said that they experienced wanting to go closer and closer to hear it. That music was so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So Andy and George went to the place, and they had to climb a ridge. And when they reached that ridge, Andy said, "Yeah, this is the point." When they reached the top of the ridge, there was about a 10-foot fall, right
goodness.
into open water.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't feeling very good about staying much longer.
Yeah.
And we thought, for the first time since our outing, I think we'd better all call back home how the weather is, how everyone is, because when we don't worry, we have more adventures out out on the land. So we called home, and we had my oldest daughter at home was Jerry, who was babysitting her younger sister Heather at the time. So I called Jerry and asked to to give me the weather forecast for the next couple of days, and she did. And apparently, what was going to happen that morning was winds gusting from 90 to 100.
Mm-hmm.
So she gave us that, and I told her, "Well, expect us home sometimes today, you know, for her to keep a watch out for lights," but that wasn't going to happen because the storm had already started. 90 was the steady wind.
Yeah.
The gusts were over 100. So we packed up. We all packed up, and for the very first time, I didn't trust myself driving my skidoo. Headwind at that high speed, so I left my skidoo in Lizard. And I got on Andy's skidoo, so we were going to double ride. 4 people double riding all the way home. And like I told you about the length of time it got us from Politic to Lizard was an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm.
We started traveling. At times we were traveling by the coast. At times we could not even see the coastline. We couldn't see around us. Sometimes we were 2 feet behind George's skidoo, and we couldn't see the red light, the red tail light. And we traveled slowly. We really traveled slow, and we stopped every so often, had a little break, and continued. And it pretty well got into the dark side. And the nice thing about traveling in winter, at nighttime, you could see the haze of the community lights from a long distance.
Because it's all dark.
But we couldn't
around.
see it
Oh,
through that storm.
yeah.
And I looked at my watch and said, we're out here for 4 hours. I know once in a while I could recognize the land.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell where we are to the driver in front of me, and we kept on until we got maybe a kilometer and a half out of town. We finally saw the haze when the storm got down,
Yeah.
but it came up again. So we knew we were home. We were out traveling from Lazard to Polituck for 5 hours.
Mm.
And the girls were already expecting me. I told them our departure time.
Mm-hmm.
And they were extremely worried by the time the 5th hour came. And when we parked our skidoo outside, the wind was so strong, I really couldn't get my bearings, and the door flew open. My daughters came out, brought me in, and I
Oh.
was all caked in snow and everything. And the skidoo passed us, so we knew that Mariah and George were also at home
Yeah.
too. So that was one of our adventures out, and it's always an adventure traveling with George and Mariah.
I was gonna ask you, so I've never been to Polituck, but I grew up in Tuck and I lived in Sax Harbor. The blizzards that they have are very different for me. The blizzards in Tuck, snow, you can't see nothing. The blizzards in Sax Harbor, they're high winds, but I still could see like down the street, looking at streetlights. How is it in Polituck? Is it like more like Tuck, where there's lots of snow, or is it just really high winds?
There's a lot of snow, just like Tuck.
Mm-hmm.
The winds are more brutal.
Oh.
There are some winters that, an occasional winter where you walk on top of a roof and,
Yeah.
oh, yeah.
I've seen a few of those blizzards in Tuck too.
And that happens
Yeah.
in Tuck also.
Yeah.
Our strongest wind is from the south.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're traveling and we're hitting bumps, we know that we're heading
Yeah.
the coast towards Polituck.
Mm-hmm.
And how we made it that night especially, even George could not see anything.
Mm-hmm.
Ironically, he's a master at traveling by the stars.
Mm-hmm. Oh wow.
And how we got home that night at gusting to over 100
Mm-hmm.
was George's ability to travel by the stars. And if you know, the stars travel
Yeah.
slowly, and he's traveling, and then he'd pick a name of another star and follows it. And he didn't fail. We stayed by the coast the whole time.
Yeah.
And when we got to the side, when the snowbanks became sideways, we knew that we were entering the Polituck Harbor.
That makes so much sense, because I remember, I'm gonna share a story of my dad's. He got, like, I don't know the winds. I was just a child. I don't know how strong the winds were, but I knew a blizzard had hit, and he was out caribou hunting, and the same thing. It was blowing, and I think him and his partner were driving in circles. So they had to stop, and then they said that the way they got out of it was following the snowdrifts. He said that he noticed the snowdrifts were going a certain way, so he knew which way to go based on the snowdrifts and which way the wind was coming, that it brought him to the old ice road to Tuck. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
That it's just knowledge of the land.
And that's what today's youth are never taught intensely.
Mm-hmm.
And if they are, they may just accept the GPS sort thing.
Yeah.
So at any time, no matter how young the people are, it's up to the elders and the knowledged hunters that go out to show the land, the forms, the sky, the kind of snowdrifts, because if your GPS breaks down,
Yeah.
you won't get home. If you don't have the ability to do that.
Yeah.
And that's exactly how I raised my daughters to travel. Sometimes they travel alone or with all ladies travel. Polituck is famous for that. The women do go out traveling to enjoy days out on the land. But the ability to know how to travel has got to be taught from the hunters to the young people. And how, and that way you teach your young ones to live the hardships of life, but enjoy it because you are where you know you can get home from one point to the next. The best places to fish, the best places to hunt, and you still know how to get back home.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I know that there are a great deal of GPS courses to take. It's been taught in Polituck, and it has been helpful in some search and rescues, but there are times that that it cannot be used because one search and rescue team at the time, the RCMP, quite a few years ago, was louder than or was in charge of the search and rescue in town. And it started to blow. It started to storm. And what had happened was the RCMP ordered no rangers, no one going out. Well, Polituck is a small community, and whether the RCMP ordered it or not, the men just lined up, filled their tanks, and left in a storm because each and every one of them knew exactly where to go and which trail that the men had last reported.
Yeah.
And they all went out, and then they came back with the two men.
Yeah.
And storm or not, there were a lot of people outside so happy and congratulating. And that's a community that helps each other.
Yeah.
Now, I see time is flying so fast. So
Your first story is very interesting.
thank you. And this is a picture of my dad, Joe Thrasher, with Ross Mackay, who was a geologist mapping the whole Polituck area right up to the Horton River. And these dogs are my dad's dogs. He used them during the winter, but also during the summertime too, as pack dogs. And that was the life they lived in the 1950s. And the story that I am going to tell you, probably finish with, is a trip that Dad had made, and living in Cape Perry up here. Mom was visiting her family and her mom, Sadie Sukiyaluk in Polituck. In order to get from Cape Perry to Polituck, they overnight with their dog team. They took the dogs to rest overnight and make it to Polituck the next day. Well, Dad had started his journey, and he traveled and he was okay. Then hours and hours later, he reached the small abandoned Hudson's Bay post of Lady Harbor and pitched his tent up inside the abandoned warehouse. But he left his dogs on the harness, resting, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It was good. Did all the things to care for his dog team. Then he went inside his tent, and I like the story because he told the story up to the part of Lady Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
From there, Mom took over the story
Yeah.
from where it ended. So Dad is in Lady Harbor, and at that time they had the little primer stove, the golden primer stoves with only one burner.
Mm-hmm.
They were old, they were cool, and they were warm.
Yeah.
But aside from the primer stove, he had a candle on the side, and he started not feeling very well. He began getting disoriented, and he felt like this could be life-threatening.
Mm-hmm.
He got so weak that he could not do anything else. So, before he passed out from whatever overtook his body, he went in his sleeping bag on the toboggan
Mm-hmm.
and lashed his sled, and before he passed out,
Mm-hmm.
Became unconscious, he said 3 words: "Go home, Brownie," and that's his leader.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was out. He was out.
Yeah.
And he said he didn't remember anything from there on.
Mm-hmm.
So the story went to Mom and said she was expecting Joe any time, and he was not arriving. So she said that she was starting to feel anxious,
Mm-hmm.
and that night all the dogs around the village, the small village, started barking, howling. They knew that maybe Joe was coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So my dad's brothers were on the lookout for the dog team, and they saw a dog team entering slowly.
Mm-hmm.
The dogs really tired, with their heads down, and they looked at the toboggan, and in the dark there was nobody behind there.
Mm-hmm.
So they went in and reported it to my mom and her mom, Sadie Sukialo, my mom. And they told her, "It looks like your dad's dog team arriving,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no Joe." And my mom didn't move. She wouldn't look. She didn't want. And the dogs came closer when they felt that, there's life and they're home.
Yeah.
The dogs started to get faster, and they reached the houses, and the men took the dogs, and then they looked at the sled, and there on the sled was my dad lashed up.
Yeah.
From what he had last remembered doing, he lashed himself up, and he told his dogs to go home.
Yeah.
They made it home.
Mm-hmm.
And his brother-in-laws unlashed and carried him inside. And when they put him down, he was delirious. He was talking. They could not understand, but whatever sickness that it was that had taken over was really bad enough to make him go unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So he woke up a day later. He got up before everybody, and everybody may have been waiting for him to pass on or something,
Mm-hmm.
but he was up and making coffee for everybody. And he said, "My dogs brought me back."
Yeah.
Brownie brought him back, his leader.
Yeah.
And they never knew what kind of what overtook him to make him go unconscious at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely was not an influenza, because it would have hit all the people,
Yeah.
just airborne or whatever. But he was okay, and that was the most heroic story, and I always looked at my dad as a hero for the rest of my life.
Yeah. That's really sweet. Yeah. I like the brownie brought him home. Like, I really like that.
Dogs are like that. I
Mhm.
often see television programs where people have left or lost their dog somewhere, and they travel thousands of miles to go back to their masters.
Yeah.
But this team was bringing their master back
Mm-hmm.
home.
Back home. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
How many dogs did he have on his
We
team?
counted 8.
8?
8.
Oh, that's...
And Brownie
Mhm.
was a female.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she had other pups, but she was the best leader that we've ever heard stories about.
Yeah.
And Dad was a master storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
While Mom is working on other things, and we're camping out.
Mm-hmm.
We're camping and harvesting.
Mm-hmm.
As small kids, I remember my dad telling stories, and we're all quiet. And he's telling us say a story about the Mad Trapper, because it was during his time
Yeah.
that the Mad Trapper story had happened. So we're all listening, and we're all ready to go under the blanket. And the way he told the story was in a way that we were expecting the tent door to open and the Mad Trapper
Yeah.
facing us. But so it was later on in years I knew why he had made stories so intense.
Mm-hmm.
He needed that quiet to listen to the outside sounds, because it's grizzly bear season
Yeah.
or wolves.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very successful
Yeah.
in that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I guess that makes sense why long ago I used to hear, I don't hear it anymore, but long ago I used to hear people say for kids to be quiet. You don't hear that anymore. It makes a lot of sense that you would need your kids to quiet down sometimes, to know the surroundings and what's happening.
And my dad was a dad that never yelled,
Mm-hmm.
never spanked. And he had his ways, and they all worked.
Mm-hmm.
When he needed that quiet,
Yeah.
there were times that I would be praying, saying,
Yeah.
don't let that monster come close.
Yeah.
No?
Mm-hmm.
But he'd be listening, and we didn't know
Mm-hmm.
that at the time he needed to. He didn't have to go outside to observe, but
Yeah.
he listened for sounds, and
Mhm.
that was important. So, in ending my storytelling evenings, we have a highly acknowledged elder in Paulatuck.
Mm-hmm.
He is in advanced dementia, his family is taking good care of him in Paulatuk and will not send him out.
Mm-hmm.
His name is David Rubin, and he's the very youngest of the original Thrasher Rubin's family,
Mm-hmm.
and the only one living now. And he was a very colorful, quiet character, quiet in the way that he loved to see people gather. He loved to see people gather and dance and square
Mm-hmm.
dance, because he would play the fiddle for hours and
Mm-hmm.
hours, and people would enjoy dancing for hours and hours. He was a trapper. He traveled, he was a loner,
Mm-hmm.
a person who traveled alone and harvested alone and shared with his brothers and family,
Mm-hmm.
which is very important. Now, one story that we often want to share and make everybody nationwide even know what had really happened was in the 1950s, late 1950s, there's the community of the Dew Line station in Cape Perry,
Mm-hmm.
and a small community in Paulatuk, which was seasonal,
Mm-hmm.
and the people were harvesting out of Paulatuk before they moved back to Cape Perry, which had the only Hudson's Bay outpost at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the number of people in Paulatuk suddenly got the influenza. And the whole little community village became very sick,
Mm-hmm.
extremely sick. And the leader of our community then told his youngest brother, said, I know you're sick, but you're the strongest one. You have to travel from Paulatuk with your dog team to Cape Perry so that they could radio to a Aklavik that we
Okay.
need help in Paulatuk.
Mm-hmm.
And he left. He made the journey non-stop, traveling. He'd stop to eat, rest his dogs, and continue traveling. And lo and behold, he reached Cape Perry,
Mm-hmm.
at which time the RCMP radioed Aklavik, and Aklavik immediately sent their plane to Paulatuk with a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
and he saved the whole
Oh
community.
my goodness.
There was no medication.
Mm-hmm.
There was no doctors, nurses, or even the priest there.
Mm-hmm. In
He was in Cape Perry. Anyways, the people within themselves always highly regarded him. He was a true hero
Mm-hmm.
for having to travel all that way from Paulatuk to Cape Perry to get help.
Mm-hmm.
And the plane did land, and the plane apparently had taken off with the most sick ones in Paulatuk.
Mm-hmm.
It lifted up into the air, turned around, and landed because one of the sick people had passed away.
That fast.
It was that bad.
Mm-hmm.
And David said it was quite some time. It was quite some time that David finally saw a newspaper that was brought up for them to see.
Yeah.
And the title, the front page title, RCMP Saves the Community of Paulatuk. and he is being honored
Mm-hmm.
with a Medal of Bravery,
The RCMP.
the RCMP. He was given
Mm-hmm.
he was given a Medal of Bravery that
Mhm.
should have been given to
Mhm.
David Rubin.
Yeah.
So, in saying this, we hope that people hear it all over the world. The
Mhm.
heroes were not the RCMP
Mm-hmm.
Or politicians or anyone. In this case, it was a local,
Mm-hmm.
and he saved a whole community from perishing, because that whole community had to take intense medication
Mm-hmm.
to get over whatever influenza
Yeah.
that had hit them.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of children passed away at that time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I often say a prayer of thanking him.
Mm-hmm.
Occasionally,
Yeah.
he's just an elder who, in his lifetime, loved to gather people just to enjoy his music.
Mm-hmm.
He gathered people to enjoy for hours,
Mm-hmm.
and there was always good energy around him,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what, even his stories. He's another storyteller, but the brightest things we know about him is him and his fiddle, and he's won fiddling contests
Mm-hmm.
in the 60s and 70s,
Mm-hmm.
which was dynamic. Yeah.
Did he do a lot of square dances, like in Polytech?
Every time.
Every time.
And even up to the early mid 70s, no alcohol,
Yeah.
and people dressed their best at Christmas.
Yeah.
And the dance starts at 7 o'clock and usually ended at 7 in the morning.
In the morning. Those were the best ones. I remember those from
Yeah.
Tuck also.
Uh-huh.
Was just people dancing, and they really did dance.
Yeah.
They didn't just keep it open.
Exactly, and there were always two fiddlers, he
Mhm.
and his older brother,
Yeah.
and they learned from each other.
Yeah.
And they were best at certain fiddling songs, and the
Mhm.
other was dynamic.
Yeah.
And what we listened to for hours and hours was something. It was therapeutic.
Yeah.
In the dark days when things tend to get heavy because lack of vitamins, the
Mhm.
complete darkness,
Mhm.
things pile up on each other. This was alleviating
Mhm.
mental health,
Mhm.
and for them to just gather a whole community
Mhm.
and people talking, people sharing things, people. At that time, there was no such thing as gossip, and and people just gathered around.
Yeah.
At which time the men would also tell, my next trip will be in this place for so long
Mhm.
and whatever. But it was a community that worked together, and the nucleus of the community were the children.
Mhm.
The children were the most special ones in the community, because we come from an Inuit system where the newborn is named after the most recently deceased.
Oh, okay.
And there is great mourning, deep hurt. People's hearts are on the floor, but it is also a system. The next child to be born is named after them, and they start to assist to build the character of that child
Mhm.
from the person that's
Yeah.
been just deceased.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that sounds really beautiful.
Mm.
Those stories.
Mhm.
Yeah. If there's one thing if there's anything that we kept, was I wish the dances were still the same. I'm glad that I was old enough to remember all of that,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
it's not the same anymore. But that was my favorite part, I think, growing up in Tuck when they had jamborees and Christmas time would be all of the square dances and everyone there and everyone dancing to where everyone had to like push off to the side.
Mhm.
Yeah, those are my favorite memories.
Were you one of the ones when they're all in a circle and square dancing that you're ready, on your mark, get set, go, and you're running right across and everyone is getting mixed up?
I don't know. I don't know if
That
I
was
Yeah.
that was our favorite part, and I was very young when the square dances were
Mhm.
being played, and it was a challenge.
Mhm.
And usually, they want a perfect square dance.
Yeah.
They're dressed their best,
Mhm.
absolute best,
Mhm.
with gawaks, and the men are dressed up. Everybody's dressed up, and some of the younger ones are dressed up because they're going to a dance where a handsome guy is going, and
Yeah.
and so it's like a date in front
Yeah.
of everybody,
Yeah.
and there's us as kids waiting until they're intensely dancing,
Yeah.
swinging each other around, and
Mhm.
we make that big run right across, and everybody
No.
gets mixed up.
No, I don't think I was that person. Yeah, but no, I do remember like my favorite thing about dancing was every now and then you would get someone who a guy who really loved dancing, and he'd just twirl every girl around where their feet left the floor a little bit. Those were my favorite dances. Like, yeah, so much fun. So much it is. It was, I think, a way for us to alleviate what we were going through. Those should be brought back. those
They
types of
have to
dances.
be.
Yeah.
They have to be, and they're restarting that in Polituck,
Yeah.
where all the young people are square dancing, and they're learning, and they're just having fun.
Yeah.
And I'm looking and watching as one of the elders and thinking, there's something missing, because the ones that run across the square dance are the ones dancing now.
Yeah. Yeah.
All the fun.
Yes.
It was wonderful to be a part of that, such small communities, and everybody helping each other. No one is left behind.
Yeah. Well,
So-
what you were gonna say?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I just love listening to these stories. I've never met anyone from Polituck, especially to hear. I just love old stories like that. Yeah, I don't know if they caught it on camera, but my face dropped when you said a Wolverine. Yeah, no, that, I kind of thought you were gonna say a bear, but when you said a Wolverine, it made my heart thump a little bit, and I'm guessing he didn't get that Wolverine.
No. It showed up the next night, but it became a phantom again. They completely
find
lost it.
Yeah.
Yes. So
I didn't know they get Wolverine that high up.
they're all over the country.
Oh, okay.
There are herds of caribou during the winter time.
Yeah.
There are also herds of muskox during the winter time, and there are 2 rivers on either side of Polituck, 2 rivers each, and it is quite the community to have been settled into, where the hunters knew that they would be harvesting both east and the west.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fun. Yeah. Do you have anything else that you wanted to share?
Let
We
me
got a
see.
few more minutes.
Okay. That's
That was it?
that's my dad's stories, and my community, and maybe just another. He's a little bit of my hero, but he's a survivor. I think he's almost using up his third cat, and it's nice lives. But one of the nighttime stories that I heard when we were out camping with George and Mariah, and all the lights were turned off, and we could hear him talking at the other end of the cabin, was that one time he and his son figures were traveling from Paulatuk to Lazard by ATVs, and in crossing the Brock River, it was not successful. The water rushed and turned the bike upside down.
Oh my goodness.
And he told me that they made a huge fire. They gathered a huge fire. They couldn't get to the bike or flip it over, and the bike had the rifle. So he and his son spend the rest of the evening gathering a huge pile of wood, willows, everything to last the night. They dried up early in the evening, but during the whole time there was a grizzly hovering close by. Wouldn't get close enough. There's something about bears and fire.
Yeah.
As long as you had that fire on, that grizzly would not come, but it was coming closer and closer. So as night time drew on, George told me that he started carving a pole, a willow, a wood. He started for a spear. And he made a couple of those, one for his son and one for himself. And they kept the fire going. They gathered so much wood that it was good enough for the dark hours. And they were able to keep the bear a distance as long as that fire kept on going. And that's something that I wouldn't have thought of if I were alone. I would be pretty well close to the fire. But he had survival techniques from when he was growing up to survive an attack from a bear without a rifle. And he'll probably tell you that story one day when he does make a trip from Inuvik. Yes.
One of the only times I seen a grizzly bear, I seen it twice. Both were here in town at an apartment building. It's quite a high up. I was sleeping though, and it was the summertime. I was sleeping, and in my dream, I could hear a bear roar. And I was thinking, like, I woke up and I thought, man, why was that bear roar was so real. I've never heard that in my life. And I look out the window, and I'm looking, like, I'm at a high apartment building, and I look down at the bottom of the stairs, and there's a big grizzly bear, and it's on its back legs, and it's roaring. And there's a guy at the top of the stairs, way high up. He's outside, and he's roaring at the bear. And I'm looking at my fiance, and I'm like, Greg, there's a polar bear, or there's a grizzly bear, and he wouldn't wake up. And I'm like, look, but I still remember hearing that roar. It woke me up, but it ran away. It had a cub, and it ran away, and the guy, he wasn't scared. He was roaring back at the bear. It was back and forth. It was quite something to see. I never saw it again, but very, very nerve-wracking. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. I absolutely enjoyed hearing your stories and getting to meet you. Yeah.
Yes, you're welcome, and it's my pleasure. I was thinking that I had my iPhone on, and I had a slew of about 10 stories to tell, because that hour wasn't going to carry.
No.
But I only got to tell 3.
Yeah, no,
We're coming back.
That's how it goes. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and oh yeah. I don't know what to say about hockey. Go Habs! That's what I'll say. Have a good night.